valuable to us as the organisers are people who are volunteers who can help and give up their time, give up some of their time, a few hours a week typically, to help us achieve one of the things that we need to do. Our next presenter is actually one of the people who've been coming to UDEN meetings pretty much since we started. Has been a great supporter and has recently volunteered even more of his time to actually start making sure that our website worked properly from the point of view of our events page. We had an events page with nothing on it, right? Everybody said, you need a jobs board. So we got a jobs board and there's no one posts jobs in it. We got an events page and there's no events on it. So Josh said, why don't I'll take care of that. I will find the events and I'll post them there. And guess what? When you do start populating it, it becomes a useful resource for our community. And they in turn then start posting events on it, which is how it's supposed to work. But anyway, so our next presenter is not only a great UDEN supporter, but importantly a UDEN volunteer as well. But what he does to get paid is he composes music. At least that's what he tells us. As I say, he's figured out five practical things that you can do as a composer. So here to tell you more about the ways to improve as a composer, it's the very great Josh. Josh. Let's hear it for Josh.
All right. Okay, so I just want to thank all of you guys for being here today, and also UDEN for having me here. So 5 ways to improve as a composer. I thought this would be a fun little presentation. To kind of start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about myself. My name is Josh Sohn. I'm a Utah native. I grew up here pretty much all my life, and then I went to the University of Utah and got a degree in music. After that, I taught in public schools. So I taught band, and I did that for about 3 years. I loved every minute of it, but during the summers, I actually fell in love with composing, and as years and years went on, I was like, I gotta try this. I gotta jump on board. And so I did that about 4 years ago now. So I started freelancing about 4 years ago, and boy, was it overwhelming at first, because it's just there's so many things to learn, and I'm sure some of you guys can relate to that, where you just start out and you have to learn about digital technology, you have to learn about how to mix and master, not to mention how to market yourself and go out to people and talk to people, just all these things about it. But this is more of the practical side of maybe just the production and the things I've learned over those years. So here's what I like to share. The main thing, I'm assuming all of you here have some knowledge in music. For the composers that are here, I assume that we share a few things in common. So the first is we all know how to play an instrument. So whether you're a string player, woodwind player, brass, whatever it is, we all know how to play something. If maybe you don't play something, maybe you're a singer. And that's still an instrument, yes. And that's something I wish I had. Okay, write music on a computer. The next one is, this is a modern thing. There are people like John Williams that still, sit by the piano and write notes with their pencils. I do that, but it's just you can't run away from writing music on a computer nowadays. So there are softwares like Cubase, Pro Tools, Ableton, and then on the notation side of things, there's things like Sibelius and Finale. The other thing that we share is we know how to incorporate virtual instruments somehow. Sometimes it's incorporating synth plugins that replicate, a really well Moog synthesizer or something like that. So there are 2 types of virtual instruments I should mention. One is the sample bass and the other is the synth bass. And we should have some general knowledge of that too. All right, so the next thing are the 5 points, all summarized. First thing is restricting or limiting yourself. It's kind of a financial approach and also a creative approach. And then building a template. Let's see if I get the pointer here. Oh, there you go. Building a template. And then building templates, meaning just to get yourself ready to compose and not have to worry about the boring stuff. Transcribing. Transcribing is basically you listen to the music and put down the notes on a piece of paper and replicate it. And then the fourth is automating with macros, shortcut keys. We all love shortcut keys. And then the last is practicing your virtual instrument like it's an actual instrument. Okay, so the first one, going into restricting yourself. The first thing I want to talk about is working on your fundamentals. So, you know, whether you're coming from like a musical theater background, or you're coming from something where you've played in a rock band with friends, everyone has a different starting point, but we all have to kind of get back into our fundamentals. And for me, as a film composer, I had to learn how to orchestrate, write for all sorts of instruments, do combinations of the instruments to create different colors, things like that. Also, on the digital side, learning how to use Cubase or Pro Tools and how to integrate that into your workflow. So the fundamentals are the most important part. Now, we think that sometimes we can buy the latest and greatest stuff, but that's not usually the case. You know, if you just work on your basic stuff first, get that down, you'll start to realize what you really do need as opposed to, you know, if it's a need or a want. I was a huge nerd as a kid, so I played a lot of RPGs, Final Fantasy. I probably played all of them at a certain point. But the way I see composing and even life is it's like an RPG, right? You gain those experience points and you level up, and you know with life and composing, that's kind of the same idea. If you want to wield that, you know, really strong sword or don the shield or helmet, sometimes you have to be at a certain point, right, to get there. And so, again, going back to investing, you want to be able to ask yourself, am I ready to buy, you know, this $1,000 audio interface or, you know, $3,000 studio monitors, when maybe right now I should just be honing down my craft, you know, something like that. The next point with that is working creatively within your limitations. So sometimes you have to force yourself to give yourself some limitations, and sometimes less is more. And think of the chiptune days, so Nintendo fans and the Super Nintendo fans. I actually, when I was learning about chiptune music, Nintendo actually only gave the composer 5 audio channels at one given point. And, I mean, you don't really think about, as a gamer at least, you don't think about the limitations, right? All you think about is the game is great and the music just sounds awesome. And as long as that's memorable, you know, you can do a lot. And so we don't really think back to those days as, like, you know, the music only had 5 audio channels. I wish, you know, there's more to it. They did what they made do with what they had, and I think that's what the most important part of the important lesson to take away from. So that's the first point. The next point I want to talk about is giving yourself a template or building a template for yourself. So in modern day composing, you have VST instruments. And sometimes you can have something like 30 VST instruments loaded up at one given time. What that means is you have to sit down, like click load, and then you might just sit around and like think about, I wonder what's for dinner later on. But you know, there are ways around this, and so I found that it was really tedious to do the kind of same task over and over. So you kind of automate that to a point where you build the template ahead of time for yourself. And so the solution with that is get a VST host. The only one that's out there right now is Vienna Ensemble Pro. And Beyond Ensemble Pro, what it is it's a separate software which will integrate into your DAW, and the software will load ahead of time, and then once you have it preloaded, you could reuse the same sounds into any session that you have loaded up into your Pro Tools, Cubase, whichever. And then on top of that, once you get the template sorted out and all your sounds selected, then you have to route it and get it to bus in a similar manner. So like let's say you have flutes, clarinets, you want to route that maybe into the woodwinds bus when you export, so it's just easier to export. Here's a picture of the example I use. So this is my template that I have for the Vienna Ensemble. On the right is my Cubase template, and you'll see that's all color coded. You can organize it whichever way you like. My tip is if you're into the big film scoring, you want to organize in score order. So I started mine with piccolos, all the way down to flutes, oboes, clarinets, and then you have your brass instruments and your percussion, your strings, and choir. So it's a lot of work up front, but once you get that going, it really does save a lot of time. And this is actually something I took notes from a composer, established composer named Leon Willits. I took a lesson from him, and he actually he said that actually the most important thing that you need to do is to pick the best inspiring sounds. I mean, there's so many libraries out there, right? But what's most important is you find ones that you like, because these are all sampled. And what that means, sampled, is
Real instruments.
Yeah, you have real instruments that are being recorded. And so what? Just think about the conductor going in front of the live players for that day, and he has his baton up and he's saying, "All right, guys, I want you to play a C note. Ba. Okay, let's do a D. Da." And that's all they do for the whole day. They just record and sample these instruments. And so you can see how boring it could be for the players. And some of these players might be playing without a lot of passion behind it. And you can hear that in certain sample libraries. So you got to find ones that sound good to you and you can tell had a lot of passion behind it. Once you get your sound selected, the next thing is to organize them, and you want at least one short patch and one long patch, and then the trills, tremolos, things like that that are maybe more specific to each instrument. And then the next thing is balancing your instruments, and this is important for if you actually use instruments from different sample library companies. So they all have different levels that you have to match. So try to have them behave the same way. So start with the loudest instruments like brass, and then just go down, and as it gets quieter, it kind of balances itself out. And then the other thing is for envelopes, like the releases and the attack times, sometimes you need to tweak that just a little bit so they all behave the same. And then the last thing is routing your instruments. So, I mean, this is the boring part, really. It's just a lot of work organizing and click, drag, click, and move it to stereo out to bus woodwinds. So I hope I'm not speaking Chinese to some of you. All right, so that's building a template, and that's something anyone can do. I mean, it doesn't have to be the big orchestra sound. It could be, if you're an electronic composer, you can organize your patches like synth leads and plucks and synth pads and so on.
Alright, so this is my template. With the template I use day to day, it's important to keep it organized and neatly color-coded if you can. That way it's just easier to access. So to open up each folder, I have the woodwinds, and they start in score order. So we have piccolo. Just give you an idea. And they have different patches, as you can see here, from we got sustain, staccato, marcato, and so on. Then it goes down to the flute, oboe, English horn, clarinet, bass clarinet, bassoon, and then contrabassoon. Then we have here our brass instruments. Brass, we have some solo horn. So the solo horn sounds like this. As opposed to maybe my 6 horn. Okay, and so on. Trumpet, multi-trumpet. We got solo trombone, multi-trombone, and so on. So you get the idea. When you go through each one, it's just so fun to just pick an instrument and then start jamming on it. You got, things like this where you can just put the suspended cymbal down. So drums are fun in the percussion section, and then down the list we have our very important string section. Same thing, I have solo patches, and then I also have ensemble patches and various different articulations. Alright, and then down here we have some choir patches, and that's fun to layer in the orchestral setting. I also want to show you how that's routed. So I use Vienna Ensemble Pro, which I think is the only host that seamlessly works with any DAW, and you'll see that I have 2 instances, and these are actually all preloaded. So there's a lot of VST instruments, as you can see, and all of that's routed into here. If I were to open up my mixer, okay, then you can see how all that's routed, and it takes a little bit of time, but once you get that all going, it will work like clockwork for each session that you work on.
Basically shows your overview. And by the way, I will have all of this on my blog later on, so I'll show you a link to that, and you can see this video if you want later on. For the next point, this is the biggest game changer that I want to share for you guys that compose. When I started out, there were a few times where I got hired to do something, and I had the confidence, and I thought I had the skills, and you go in and they go, okay, well, we want this kind of sound. I was like, sure, let me do that. And then as you dive into the project, you realize how much you really don't know about the genre until you actually are in the middle of something. So what I told myself I needed to do was just kind of go back and study and try to reproduce something. And the biggest advice I got from one of my teachers was, transcribe as much as you can. What I mean by that is listen to the track, one of your favorite tracks that you like, and sit down and just note for note, play back, rewind, play back, and get all the notes down on a piece of paper. You can start with the melody, bass line, the percussion tracks, all of that. Get that all down, and then the next step to that is reproduce it. So if you have the sounds, or if they're decent quality sounds, you could probably get by with it. And this is kind of more an elaborate step-by-step thing about that. So you get you listen, you write down. On step 2, you talk about preparing your session. So you might want to, let's say it's a song like Tennessee from Pearl Harbor, where there's a lot of push and pull, and the tempo is never static. It's always going slower and faster. That's where you want to maybe map the tempo and get the beats to line up with the original track. And then the next step is mute your original track and then try to record and program all your instruments, with the melodies and whatnot. And then once you get that, mix it down and master it down, and you learn a lot. There's the whole key about this is not to be a good copycatter. We don't want to be copycats at what we do. The goal here is just to transfer what you've learned during that time into what you do with your own music. So this is what you essentially do when you write all of your music, right? You write down your notes, you prepare the session, you record, you mix, and then you deliver, you get paid, and then you can move on to the next thing. So this is a video of an example from X-Men First Class. It's a track by Henry Jackman. So I'll go ahead and show that to you. So yeah, just an example of what you could do. Thank you. I didn't realize the time. Oh man, I'm so bad at this. So I had some other examples, but I'm going to skip forward. I did one for a New Line Cinema logo. Okay. So the New Line Cinema logo is not available now. It was popular back in the 90s. So it doesn't have to be, like a 3-minute track. It could just be like a 30-second logo. And I did a Stairway to Heaven drum solo there. And this is a slowed down version, so you can kind of hear that for all you composers or musicians. And then I just did my own version. So it can just be a little part, like an instrument part that you'd like to transcribe. Anyways, that was the biggest game changer for me. The more I did that, the more production value I had. The skill level, I thought, just increased by leaps and bounds. And then, so with the short amount of time, I'll just briefly go over the next two. We all use shortcuts, Control-C for copy, Control-V for paste. There are things that you can use, like for wheels, sliders, knobs on your MIDI controller. There's all sorts of tricks you can do. My modulation wheel, for example, I programmed that so it's CC11 instead of CC1, which is the expression, just because you might use that more. And then for pads, I actually programmed my pads so that you can go up and down to navigate on your DAW, or there's a pad on my right hand where I just press to undo something. So, we record something. If you don't like it, you can just undo right away, rather than going to the mouse or, the keyboard. You can just do it right on the MIDI controller. Then there's computer keyboard shortcuts. There's a lot of composers that use touch tablets. So this is a Junkie XL's setup. If you're familiar with Junkie XL or Tom Hockenborg, he did Deadpool and Mad Max, the newest Mad Max. And his screen, that's actually not a monitor, but that's just his tablet. And he has little squares to do every command that is hooked up to his DAW to do different commands that way. Also, I have a composer friend that uses the same concept with the touch tablet, but rather than using the tablet to do the commands, he'll use his voice. And he uses something like drag and touch to trigger a command, and then saves you so much time if you can figure out different ways that way.
Hi, so with MIDI controllers, you can do a lot of different shortcuts. So the first one is the drum pads. Drum pads can be set to really anything, and so besides setting it to kick and snare, why not use it as a command feature? So I decided to do the very left-hand square pads for my up and down. If I do this one, it actually expands different things. And then on the very end is my undo button. So let's say you're recording something and you go, and let's say you didn't really like that, then you can just go back and undo, go back and record again. Use your transport buttons. You can't really see it, but it's on my right hand side of the keyboard, and I can use this to rewind. I can stop, play back, and then you have your wheels down here. So the wheels and the sliders. What I like about this controller is that the slider and the wheel are actually close by each other, and so I use that to my advantage. First off, I have this is normally your modulation or CC1. I actually changed that to my CC11 expression. Alright, but I also like the option of having the CC1 and CC11 together. So my first slider here is CC1, and the second slider would be CC11. And this is good for brass patches because brass require one to have like that tinny sound. And if you go all the way down, then it's more tame. So if you do both at the same time, which my CC11's over here, I can go and work on nice crescendo builds. Okay, so that's the MIDI controller stuff. Alright, the other things I want to show you are macros that you can set to really speed up the process of editing your MIDI sounds. First one will be this little section that I made. Okay, as you can see, there's probably like 8 or 9, if not more, patches going at the same time. They're all spiccato or very short sounding string sections. So what you can do is, normally you can go here, highlight, and adjust the velocity that way, but that would only adjust one of those patches. As you can see over here, there's so many different ones. So if I were to do this and do Control All, do that, it doesn't control all the other ones, as you can see. So if I were to go back and do it again, I could actually do this. I just put it as Shift Alt minus, and that what that does is it actually controls globally all those instruments, negative about 4 units each, and let's go up and down that way. So here's the difference. So you can see how that would help save some time to change all the velocities at the same time. And that actually applies also to CC controller lanes, such as CC11 for the expression. So let's check that out. I'm going to adjust all of that. Here we go. Okay, so let's say I wanted to maybe do a global change on all of these, because normally if I were just to highlight one of these patches, and I can drag in up and down pretty quickly, but then let's say if I do it on one, I would have to do on the other one and do that 10 times in a row, right? So a quick way to do this is you just highlight your track or the section, and then notice how I just pressed P and it went from left to right on the locators here. So now what you could do is you can press the button Control Alt and then End or Home, and this will globally change the entire section that's highlighted. Okay, so that gives you an idea. You can do that for CC1 as well. One other thing I thought was really fantastic was when you actually want to re-record the part itself. Well, you can actually delete the entire thing all at once. So I can just go Alt F11 and Alt F1, and you see how all of those controller lanes just disappeared. So, and that will disappear for all of those sections that were highlighted. Okay, so I don't have any controller lanes that have MIDI in this locator range, and then I can just go back and re-record it. So I will have to highlight each section here. Now I'm recording.
The last one is practicing your virtual instruments like a real instrument. The reason why is we want to save time. We don't want to start recording something on our keyboard and then go back and, rather than re-recording it, go back and, like tweaking the expression curves or the velocities. We want to try to record it with as little editing as possible. So what I mean by that is maybe put the metronome on, try to work on getting good crescendos and diminuendos too. So the next step after you do, just kind of practicing that, try to practice over some excerpts. So what I've done is some examples, but like, Fellowship of the Rings from Lord of the Rings, there's that famous flute solo. Try to get a flute patch going and try to replicate all the dynamics involved and the articulations for each thing. So anyways, some suggestions that you can use for that. If you're familiar with Game of Thrones, the cello melody in the beginning, the fanfare for the common man in the classical world, the big trumpet solo. Okay. And then if we have a moment, John, I'm going to just play you the first 2 minutes of this. And this is an example of playing an instrument from virtual, like a pro. Go ahead. So you don't have to play that, like go to those extremes. But my point is, if you can, harness a little bit of that, when you create music, it'll just go a lot faster. For a full tip of all the things that I've talked about, I actually have 10 ways to improve as a composer on the blog, so you can go there.
Secret.
All right, and so that is it. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
So, you were talking about when you are recording and mixing the instruments that you should start in the background and then move to the foreground.
Oh yeah.
Why do you do it that way instead of starting with what you hear best first and then moving back?
That's a good question. I was thinking about where to start. You don't have to follow that rule, but I think it's good to actually start with the background first. Just generally speaking, from watching a painter. I got this from watching Bob Ross, if you're familiar with Bob Ross. He always starts with a background, big brush strokes, get the sky going, get the oceans, the happy trees after that. And then, so what like that, the background would be, in music, it would be kind of like maybe the drums or the bass lines. If you can get good bass lines in the foundation, get those dynamics going, then once you start layering the melody and the harmonies afterwards, it starts to sit better in the mix, I think. Yeah.
Josh, you start with the atmospheres first. Like, if you get an empty screen, all you have is dialogue. You start with, like an atmosphere, so you have a feeling to begin with.
Oh yeah. Are you talking as a sketch, or more like the starting point to record your track on?
Yeah, starting point to get the movie like a feeling,
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, if you're talking about pads, like using pads, those are great. I guess my approach right now is trying to exploit all the orchestral instruments I use. And so maybe that's not in my wheelhouse right now, but for me, I'd love to incorporate more of that, more synth pads and sampling like various random instruments, incorporating that into the mix. But yeah, I kind of stick with orchestral stuff for now. Yeah. Yes.
You know who Victor Wood is?
Victor Wood, yes.
Yeah, he always says, don't practice, play.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah.
Practice sounds like work,
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I mean, practice is kind of like what the your piano teacher says to you, and you're like 7 years old, and it's just kind of boring. Yeah, that's sort of the word practice. But like for me, practicing composing is such a various, vague thing, and so you kind of have to just pick one thing at a time.
You have to practice what you like.
Practice.
So you enjoy it. It's not practice if you enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what he was saying. Play. Play is such a much more fun word.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. Play. Yeah, and and also as a composer, it's easy to kind of get bogged down in your little hole in the studio, but it's also important just to get out there, play as much as you can, because we tend to forget that once you're in a studio setting all the time. Yes.
So Josh, as you know, UDEN, we're all about trying to find ways to collaborate, work together, and build something bigger than we already have.
Yeah.
Thinking about the work you do, composition, and the different areas that it applies to. What advice would you give us to, as a community, to grow the amount of work that someone like yourself would get? What do you need?
Oh, well, you need time. You need a lot of passion. You need to be really passionate in what you do. So whether that's
How do you get more business, I guess? Is the question.
well, how do you get business? Okay, yeah. I mean, well, you kind of have to build yourself somewhere. We all come from different walks of life. I came from like a rock, jazz, classical background. So I try to make use of my advantages I've had, and then you try to make a system or some kind of, something in place where you can reach out to people. So for me, at least, I actually made a list of filmmakers and game studios on a spreadsheet, and then called people up as much as I could, emailed, and there are people that will give you a foot in the door, and there are other people that will say, the good old, we use music libraries, and that's fine. That's just kind of the nature of the industry right now. People are using music libraries to license music that's already pre-recorded on the website. But there's still a lot of people that need custom original music.
I'd also add, as far as UDEN goes, I feel like music is something that is so essential, and everyone knows that it is essential to media and lots of other things, and yet, maybe this isn't always true, but I feel like a lot of times as a composer, we are not considered as part of the team. We're considered as an afterthought. I don't know if you agree with that, but a lot of times it's like, we've got this project going and it's so exciting, and now, wait, we need music.
Yeah.
We'll just hire you for the music. But as far as like what I'm looking for in UDEN, what I've found a lot of times, but I think it can improve, is to be included in the projects and to actually be considered a team member when it comes to creating those projects. That's how we're going to be able to create our best work.
How to get more involved? I mean, one thing I did last year was I went to the pre-production meetings for this short film that I was asked to do. So, it was really cool to see that, because I'm just coming from a background of, here's the music, like here's the film, go ahead and score. But there's just a lot more that's involved when you go into these pre-production meetings.
When Spielberg would have John Williams would shoot the whole process. He was in the ed team.
Oh, yeah.
What was going on so that he could, do his best for the film.
Yeah. So, I think the more you're involved, the better. Exactly.
I mean, not film, music will make or break.
Yeah. I mean, I think when it comes all down to it is, how bad do you want to do this? And, you kind of have to develop a lifestyle that will fit, your needs as wanting to be a composer. And so, whatever you can do to get there and figure out, the next step in life, I think that's important. But to also come back around to UDEN, I think going to meetings like this is a great start. And also sharing your trade secrets. To me, this is a lot of hard work when you think about transcription projects and whatnot. But that's the idea. Is just have the abundance mentality, not the scarcity mentality. All right. Thanks.
So I think from a UDEN perspective then, I think something you could take Josh as an example is somebody who put himself out in front of the UDEN community. And it's, we spoke at one of the very first Hiving Night individual sessions that we had. said, hey, here's what I do. And we said, you've got 3 minutes to pitch everything you can do. And he gave it his best shot, and he's been involved ever since. And I think the primary thing we try and do at UDEN is actually bring people together for networking, right? And we also then try and teach them something. So typically in a couple of hour meetings, we have like an hour keynote about something, and then we have an hour or so networking. So we'll run those tomorrow night. We'll be here if anybody wants to get along with UDEN team. But that would be my advice to you, is use UDEN for its purpose, which is we're trying to bring people together. And I think something you made a note of, music libraries. Could you have a concept of maybe getting together with the other composers here, building a Utah? And then go to the companies here and say, hey, support local, right? Like I said earlier, right? If we all work with local companies whenever we could. One of the reasons that I suspect that people like us, game companies, don't come to you and say, do it for us, is because, we don't get someone up to speed, and whereas when you go to a music library and say, look, that's what we want. If you had like a portal for composers, and I'm spitballing now, but in Utah, it's a local talent, contact us for more information if you want something like this or what have you. Or just pay us for this, this bumper or this piece or whatever you were. It's effectively like audio blocks for the Utah. And that way, the message we can give is support local. And maybe there's something we can do with writers and game developers and film producers. We can do it with Utah, but I don't know, just Utah Game Audio. Yeah,
We already have that.
Okay, we'll be back in 10 minutes. We're going to be talking about something. UDEN, this year our focus is all about business development. And we're trying to find ways to help you get better at what you do. Partly it's sharing expertise, like Josh has just done about. So now I'm going to be a great composer, 5 times better than I was.